Thank you. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. Ms. Garza, as I look at this situation, and you certainly have a lot of experience both in the CIO arena as well as in public service, and we do appreciate that. A lot of times public servants are taken for granted, but with your broad experience, that's not taken lightly. But still, as we examine this issue, we're trying to get to who is responsible for making the operational and security decisions for the data retrieval tool.
Sir, as I said in my opening testimony, we're all responsible for ensuring that cybersecurity is our top priority. As a group, we look at every risk assessment, we evaluate the situation, and we make the decisions as to what level of risk we're willing to take with the application that we are talking about. Over the last year since Get Transcript, we've become much more conservative. But we evaluate the situation, we discuss it, and we determine what actions we need to take.
Now, in your testimony, you'd mentioned that this was unique because unlike attempts or attacks on the IRS and the different departments within the IRS, this involved a different department. So you had one end of the pipe and the other end of the pipe. So when you learned in September 2016 that it was possible to, with, quote, little stolen personal information, end quote, for a hacker to pose as a student and access the DRT tool and the data stored on that tool, why did you not move to immediately secure the tool through encrypting or otherwise masking the sensitive information accessible through the DRT?
So there was a couple of actions that we took at that time. First of all, there was no data loss at the time. We had no evidence of fraud at the time. We immediately...
Well, there was no evidence of fraud, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't. I mean, you had a clear indication that something was awry. Yes or no?
We looked at the analytics, and we looked at all of the data that we had available to us at the time, and we did not see anything suspicious. We contacted the Department of Education. Both cyber organizations started to work to look at the data, and the data did not reveal that there was any kind of penetration going on at that time.
And I guess, and here's the information that I'm speaking at specifically, the isolated case, did it not result in an indictment that is still processing in the courts from September 13th?
It was a single case, and they did not get the data.
Well, I guess then let me follow on this vein, because what I hear each of the panel saying is that no data breach, no problem. And then I hear Mr. Camus say 100,000 investigation ongoing and fraudulent returns filed, and I'll come back to some of that. But Mr. Gray, to what extent do you think that the department is responsible for securing the data accessible on FAFSA.gov and other web-based applications?
100% we're responsible for securing our data.
Okay, but yet we see what the Department of Ed saying, hey, give us a tool. We have the IRS saying, here's your tool, and you've got data coming out the spigot on one end. You think it's secure on the other. There's a leak. And yet it took you how many months from September to February to even recognize and say, no, we thought it was legitimate in September, but now we think we might have a problem. That is a big period of breach. So would you say that you have a responsibility for, you do have that responsibility, but that wasn't perceived as such in September?
It was perceived that there was a potential vulnerability in September, October, and the two departments worked together to create a solution that would prevent that vulnerability from being exploited. It did, when it became an exploited vulnerability, which was in March, is when we took the appropriate action to bring it offline.
And yet it wasn't shut down when you had indication in the start of a new financial aid season. And I guess what I'd like to do is, Mr. Runcie, you said that there was no evidence that info was accessed, but were fraudulent returns filed with regard to this data?
Mr. Chairman, I can't tell you if fraudulent returns were filed or not. What I can tell you, because we're not privy to that information, what we did was we analyzed the Social Security numbers, IP addresses. We did a pretty exhaustive examination looking at indicators of risk, and we returned that information to the IRS so that they could complete some of their analysis. In September, as I mentioned earlier in my oral comments, we, at that point, probably had filed 50 million applications using the DRT. So we filed a substantial amount of applications using the DRT going back 7 years to 2010. It is an evolving landscape, and it's quite possible, as we've said, that the criminals and the fraudulent activity, you know, they're innovative, and so things change. But over that period of time, there wasn't any documented material criminal activity on the DRT. When that was found and confirmed, it was shut down. So there's a history there that, one, we relied on, even though we continued to monitor it, and then we balanced that against the risk of shutting off the tool and all the implications around shutting those tools.
Well, there's always a risk of protecting taxpayers, and I want to be respectful of the time here, but before I turn it over to the ranking member, you know, what it appears is that we're not identifying that we had a breach, and it's made us more vulnerable. And with that, we'll come back to some of that at a later time. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.